I am Julian. I am 28 years old, and exactly 15 years ago, my parents drove me to a drab county office, signed a single piece of paper, and surrendered me to the state foster care system because I was not the strong, athletic son they wanted. Tonight, however, I am standing in the grand foyer of a $15 million estate in the West Hills of Portland, wearing a cheap, scratchy polyester valet uniform. I am surrounded by the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the heavy scent of expensive cigars, and the suffocating perfume of the local elite. Across the room, bathed in the warm, golden glow of a massive crystal chandelier, are the two people who brought me into this world, the people who threw me away like a broken toy. My mother, Eleanor, and my father, Richard. They are celebrating their 35th wedding anniversary with a lavish vow renewal ceremony. And they forced me to be here, not as an honored guest, not as their long-lost son, but as their hired help. As I stood quietly by the coat check, blending into the shadows as I had learned to do my entire life, my mother walked over. She was dripping in pearls that I knew for an absolute fact were bought on high-interest credit cards. She looked me up and down, her eyes full of that exact same disgust she had looked at me with when I was a sick, helpless child. She leaned in close, her smile perfectly frozen for the benefit of her wealthy friends nearby, and whispered a threat right into my ear. "Try not to look too pathetic tonight, Julian. You are actively scaring the guests with that miserable face. Just take the coats, keep your head down, do the job you were meant to do, and maybe I won't go to the press and ruin that little architectural firm of yours tomorrow morning." She patted my cheek, a gesture so cold and condescending it made my stomach turn. Then she smiled her perfect, venomous smile and drifted back to her high society friends. She thought she had me backed into a corner. She thought she held all the cards and that I was still that terrified 10-year-old boy desperate for her approval. But there was a massive, life-altering secret she and my father didn't know. They had no idea about the inheritance. They had no idea about my actual net worth. And most importantly, they had absolutely no idea that just 48 hours ago, my lawyer finalized the real estate paperwork to purchase this exact historic estate they were currently renting for the night. I wasn't their valet. I was their landlord, and I was about to evict them in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress in their entire miserable lives. Before I tell you exactly how I turned this night into the most satisfying moment of my entire existence, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button if you believe that karma always comes to collect its debts in the end. And please, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight. It helps me know that sharing this painful journey means something to someone out there. Now, let's go back to the beginning, long before the money and the mansions, to the day my parents decided I was no longer worth keeping. The polyester collar of the valet jacket bit harshly into my neck. It smelled terribly of industrial detergent and old, nervous sweat. Eleanor had specifically demanded I wear this atrocity. The invitation she had sent to my private office wasn't a request for a heartfelt family reunion. It was a blatant extortion letter. Wear the suit, park the cars, serve the family you abandoned, or she would go to the local press. She threatened to spin a massive web of lies. She would tell them that Julian Sterling, the rising star architect of Portland, was a heartless monster who left his poor, aging parents to rot in poverty while he lived a life of absolute luxury. In her twisted, narcissistic mind, this public humiliation was her way of putting me back in my place. The place of the weak, useless second son. I reached up and slowly loosened the cheap clip-on tie they had sent in the box. Underneath the stiff, terrible fabric of the uniform jacket, the silk of my custom-tailored bespoke shirt was cool against my skin. It was a secret armor. I watched my father laugh loudly across the room, clapping a local senator on the back with false bravado. I watched my older brother, Tristan, the golden boy of the family, aggressively flirting with a bridesmaid while sipping top-shelf scotch he definitely could not afford. They looked so incredibly confident, so arrogant, so completely untouchable. I took a deep breath, letting the noise of the party wash over me. The soft jazz band playing in the corner. The hum of meaningless, pretentious small talk. The clatter of silver trays carrying expensive appetizers. It all slowly faded away, replaced by a memory so sharp, so brutally clear, it still felt like it could draw blood from my chest. It was the memory of the day my father looked at a 10-year-old boy who just wanted to be loved, and decided, with cold business logic, that his own son was a bad investment. Growing up in the Vance household felt like living in a strict military barracks where the only acceptable currency was aggressive, toxic masculinity. My father, Richard, was a man who measured a person's worth entirely by their physical dominance, their volume, and their ability to intimidate others in a room. He was a mid-level executive at a regional logistics firm, a man who believed every single conversation was a negotiation and every relationship, even with his children, was a transaction. He didn't want sons to love. He wanted soldiers to reflect his own ego. My mother, Eleanor, was his perfect, shallow mirror. She cared only about appearances and zip codes. To her, the neighborhood HOA meetings were a literal battlefield, and our family had to be the undisputed royalty of the suburbs. She spent hours curating the perfect garden, the perfect holiday cards, the perfect image of a loving American family. Then there was Tristan, my older brother by 3 years. Tristan was everything my father ever wanted and everything my mother wanted to show off. He was loud, physically imposing, wildly reckless, and an absolute star on the high school football field. When Tristan broke a neighbor's expensive bay window with an errant baseball, my father didn't punish him. He laughed it off, handed the neighbor some cash, and loudly praised his son's incredible arm strength. When Tristan bullied smaller kids at school and the principal called home, my parents didn't discipline him. They called it natural leadership qualities and blamed the other kids for being too sensitive. Tristan could do no wrong. He was the golden boy, the heir to the Vance legacy. And then there was me, Julian. I was born premature, struggling for breath from the very first minute of my life. I was saddled with a weak immune system and a severe, chronic case of childhood asthma. I spent most of my early years indoors, watching the neighborhood kids play from behind a glass window. I didn't care about sports. I couldn't run without my chest feeling like it was packed with burning glass. I cared about building things. I would spend hours sitting quietly at the kitchen table with graph paper, rulers, and pencils, drawing intricate floor plans of houses, towering bridges, and entire imaginary cities. I built worlds where I felt safe because my real world was a minefield. My father hated it. No, that's not strong enough. He hated me. I was a direct, living offense to his massive ego. I was a reminder that he couldn't control everything. I remember one specific Thanksgiving dinner. The entire extended family was gathered around the massive oak dining table. The silver was polished, the turkey was perfectly carved. My uncle, trying to make polite conversation, looked across the table and asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I put down my fork and quietly said I wanted to be an architect. The silence that followed was deafening. My father slammed his fist on the table, rattling the expensive silverware and knocking over a wine glass. He looked at me with pure, unfiltered contempt. His face turned an angry red. "A Vance doesn't sit at a desk drawing pretty pictures like a little girl," he spat, his voice echoing in the dining room. "A Vance builds empires with his bare hands. You're soft, Julian. You're pathetic. You're a financial liability to this family." I remember shrinking down in my chair, wishing the floor would open up and swallow me. My mother just dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin and asked my aunt about her golf swing, completely ignoring the tears streaming down my face. The older I got, the more painfully obvious the divide became. When Tristan turned 16, a brand new, fully loaded truck appeared in the driveway with a giant red bow on it. I got hand-me-down clothes that swallowed my thin frame, shirts that smelled like Tristan's old cologne. Tristan had a massive college fund set up by my parents before he even started his freshman year of high school. When I asked my mother if I could take a summer drafting class at the community college, she scoffed and told me they weren't wasting money on a hobby I would inevitably fail at. I wasn't even allowed to ask about college. The final, brutal straw came the year I turned 10. My father's logistics company was going through a major downsizing phase, and he was feeling the immense financial pressure of keeping up their wealthy facade. To a man like Richard Vance, the household budget needed immediate trimming, and I was the easiest, most logical expense to cut. I wasn't bringing him glory on the football field. I wasn't enhancing the family image. I was just another mouth to feed, a potential medical bill waiting to happen, a permanent stain on his perfect family portrait. I will absolutely never forget that Tuesday morning. It was late November. It was raining heavily, the sky over Portland a heavy, bruised purple. The house was freezing. I sat at the kitchen island eating cold toast, trying to finish my math homework. My father walked in, wearing his perfectly tailored gray suit, holding a thick manila folder. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't sit down. He just looked down at me, his eyes devoid of any human warmth, and delivered the sentence that shattered my childhood. "Go up to your room and pack a bag, Julian. One small suitcase. You're leaving." I froze. I thought it was a punishment. Maybe I hadn't taken out the trash properly. Maybe my coughing the night before had kept him awake. I slid off the stool and started crying, begging him, apologizing frantically for whatever I had done wrong. I promised I would be better, quieter, stronger. My mother stood right by the marble sink, carefully washing a ceramic coffee mug. She heard every single word of my begging. She didn't even turn around. She just kept scrubbing that same spot on the porcelain, her shoulders completely relaxed. 2 hours later, my father drove me in total silence to the downtown County Family Services building. He marched me inside, the rain soaking my thin jacket. He handed my single, battered suitcase to a tired-looking social worker at the front desk. Then he sat down and signed a stack of state custody papers. He surrendered all parental rights to his own son with the exact same emotional detachment he would use to close an underperforming bank account. He stood up, adjusted his tie, turned around, and walked out the glass doors into the rain. He never said goodbye. He never looked back. The foster care system in this country is not designed to heal broken, traumatized children. It is designed to store them away so polite society doesn't have to look at them. My first placement was a rundown house in a bad neighborhood with 6 other displaced kids. The foster parents treated us entirely like a real estate investment. Bring in as many bodies as legally allowed by the state, collect the government stipend every single month, and spend the absolute bare minimum on cheap food and heat. I learned very quickly how to be completely invisible. If you were silent, if you didn't ask for a second portion at dinner, if you never complained about the freezing temperatures in the bedroom, you could survive without getting hit. But through all the hunger, the cold, and the fear, I was still drawing. I filled cheap, dollar store spiral notebooks with sketches of safe houses. Houses with incredibly thick stone walls and heavy steel doors where nobody could ever kick you out. I drew fortresses. I bounced violently through 3 different foster homes in 2 agonizing years. I was officially labeled a difficult placement by the state because I rarely spoke to anyone, refused to play with the other children, and completely distrusted every adult who tried to feed me. That is, until the universe finally showed me a sliver of mercy and I met Elena Reyes. Elena was my 3rd assigned social worker. She wasn't like the others. She was sharp, deeply observant, and she didn't talk down to me in that fake, overly sweet voice adults use when they pity a broken kid. One rainy afternoon, she sat across from me in a sterile, fluorescent-lit visitation room at the agency. I was sketching as usual, ignoring her. She didn't force me to talk. She just reached across the table, gently took my notebook, and looked critically at my drawings. She didn't see childish doodles. She saw the pain and the purpose behind what I was trying to do. "You're building armor, Julian," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. "I know why you're doing it, but eventually, if you want to survive, you have to let someone inside the walls." Elena changed the entire trajectory of my life. She fought the broken system. She pulled strings with supervisors. And a month later, she introduced me to a man named Arthur Sterling. Arthur was a highly respected, retired architect, a wealthy widower living in a breathtakingly beautiful craftsman home in the hills overlooking the city. He was 60 years old, his hair completely silver, and he had never had children of his own. When Elena brought me to his house for the first time, I was terrified. But Arthur didn't interrogate me about my grades or my behavioral record. He simply walked me past the luxurious living room, straight to a massive, professional drafting table in his sunroom. He handed me a heavy, perfectly balanced T-square, looked at my nervous hands and said, "Elena tells me you like to design safe spaces. Let's see if your foundations hold weight, son." That exact moment was the true beginning of my life. Arthur formally adopted me when I was 13. He went to court and legally gave me his name. He gave me a permanent home. But far more importantly, he gave me respect. Under Arthur's quiet, steady guidance, I finally thrived. My asthma miraculously cleared up as my stress faded. I grew tall. I threw myself obsessively into my studies, driven by a desperate, burning need to prove that Arthur's investment in me was worth it. I would not let this father down. By the time I was 25 years old, I had earned my master's degree in architecture with top honors and was a junior partner at Arthur's prestigious firm. We didn't design vanity projects for billionaires. We designed massive community centers, modern public libraries, and sustainable, affordable housing complexes. We built places that actually mattered to people. My salary was excellent, my life was beautifully stable, and I had buried the name Julian Vance so deep into the ground it felt like I was reading about a completely different person's past life. I kept a very small, tightly knit circle of fiercely loyal friends, primarily Zoe. Zoe was a tough-as-nails structural engineer I met in college. She knew everything about my past and protected my peace like a guard dog. But life, as I've learned the hard way, rarely lets you stay comfortable for long. The catastrophic storm hit exactly 1 week after my 26th birthday. Arthur, the strongest man I knew, the man who saved me, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It was terrifyingly aggressive and moved incredibly fast. He refused to die in a sterile hospital room. I moved my drafting desk into his bedroom at the house. I managed the entire architectural firm during the day, taking conference calls from his bedside, and read his favorite books to him at night. When he passed away quietly in his sleep 6 months later, it felt like the foundation of my entire world had violently cracked in half. I was alone again. The funeral was small, quiet, and deeply respectful, exactly the way Arthur wanted it. But it was the mandatory legal meeting in the lawyer's downtown office a week later that truly changed the entire landscape of my future. Arthur's estate attorney, a stern but kind older man named Mr. Harrison, slid an incredibly thick stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany table. I had assumed Arthur had left me the Craftsman house and perhaps a modest sum to keep the architectural firm running smoothly. "Julian," Mr. Harrison said, adjusting his glasses and looking at me with immense gravity. Arthur was a very prudent man. His investments over the last 40 years were substantial. He lived quietly, but he accumulated aggressively. He has left the absolute entirety of his estate to you. He handed me a single piece of summary paper. I stared at the bottom line, my brain unable to process the numbers. The house, full ownership of the firm, a massive commercial real estate portfolio spreading across 3 states, and highly diversified liquid assets. Totaled just over $27 million. Couldn't breathe. The air felt thin. I was 26 years old, an orphan twice over, and suddenly I was one of the wealthiest young men in the Pacific Northwest. I didn't want the millions. I just wanted my dad back. But Arthur had given me one final, written instruction in his will. "Julian, build something that outlasts us both. Build a legacy they can never take away." I honored him the only way I knew how. I threw myself entirely into work. I aggressively expanded the firm, winning massive urban renewal contracts and city development bids. I deliberately kept a very low profile, actively avoiding the socialite magazines, the charity galas, and the flashy lifestyle. I drove a reliable, unremarkable SUV, lived quietly in Arthur's old house, and focused entirely on the work. But enormous wealth is exactly like dropping blood in a shark-infested ocean. It inevitably attracts predators. And unfortunately for me, one of those predators was someone slithering out of my darkest past. His name was Leo. We had shared a cramped bunk bed in my second, most abusive foster home. Leo was a survivor, but he survived by stepping on other people's necks and stealing whatever wasn't bolted down. We had reconnected briefly on social media a few years ago, mostly exchanging polite, meaningless pleasantries. But Leo was currently struggling. He was bouncing between dead-end jobs, drowning in credit card debt, and he had noticed the subtle, unmistakable changes in my life. He saw the local business articles about my firm winning major city contracts. Leo did some deep, invasive digging. He found public records. He found out about the Sterling estate transfer. And then, he did what desperate rats always do. He looked for the highest bidder to sell me out to. I found this out much later, but Leo managed to track down my biological father, Richard Vance. Leo called Richard's cell phone and offered him a piece of highly lucrative information for $50,000 in cash. He told Richard that the sickly, useless son he had thrown away at the county office 16 years ago was now Julian Sterling, the sole, uncontested heir to a $27 million fortune. The betrayal was swift, calculated, and absolutely brutal. Within days of that transaction, the barrage against my peaceful life began. It started with a direct phone call to my private office line, a number unlisted to the public. I picked it up, expecting a city contractor. Instead, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in nearly 2 decades, heavy with fake, sickening emotion. "Julian? Son? Oh, thank God. It's your dad. Richard. We've been looking for you everywhere for years. Your mother and I. We made a terrible, terrible mistake. We want our family back, son." I hung up the phone immediately, my hands shaking so violently I knocked over a cup of coffee on my desk. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then came the emails. Then the letters sent via certified mail to my home address. They were absolute masterpieces of psychological manipulation. Eleanor wrote long, tear-stained, multi-page letters about how they were tragically forced to give me up because of severe financial hardship, how they genuinely thought they were giving me a much better life, how her mother's heart bled for me every single day. It was utterly disgusting. I remembered the brand new, expensive truck they bought Tristan the very next year. I remembered the luxury country club memberships they actively maintained while I was eating stale bread and wearing donated clothes in a state-run facility. They didn't give me up out of love. They threw me away because I didn't fit their aesthetic of a perfect, dominant family. But they didn't stop at just sending letters. They started showing up. Richard tried to corner me in the dimly lit parking garage of my office building late one Tuesday night. He looked much older, his face red, bloated, and desperate. "Julian, you have to talk to us," he yelled, aggressively stepping in front of my car as I frantically locked the doors and threw it into reverse. "Blood is thicker than water. You owe us a conversation. You owe this family." "I owe you nothing," I thought, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white, speeding out of the garage. But I knew men exactly like Richard Vance. They don't suddenly grow a conscience after 16 years. They follow the money. I needed to know exactly why they were so desperately hunting me right now. So, I hired the most ruthless private investigator in Portland. And what his team found was the exact key I needed to completely, legally destroy them. The investigative dossier the private investigator dropped heavily onto my desk was thicker than a phone book. Zoe sat across from me in my office, the city lights reflecting in the glass windows as we methodically flipped through the pages. The grim, pathetic reality of the Vance family was laid bare in brutal detail through bank statements, court records, and intercepted emails. Karma, it turned out, had not been kind to Richard and Eleanor Vance. Richard's logistics company had aggressively restructured 5 years ago, forcing him into an early, humiliating retirement with a mere fraction of the executive pension he had banked on. But instead of quietly downsizing and living within their means, Eleanor absolutely insisted on maintaining their wealthy, country club facade at all costs. They took out a second mortgage on their suburban house. Then they took out a third. But the real financial black hole, the absolute cancer eating away at their lives, was their precious golden boy, Tristan. Tristan had blown out his knee in a drunken fraternity accident during his sophomore year of college, permanently ending his football career before it even professionally started. Without sports to prop up his massive ego, he had nothing. He completely dropped out, burned through the massive college fund my parents had hoarded for him, and quickly developed a severe, uncontrollable gambling addiction. According to the PI's detailed report, Tristan currently owed over $500,000 to some very dangerous, unsavory people connected to illegal sports betting rings. Richard and Eleanor had entirely drained their 401k retirement accounts, liquidated every single stock asset they possessed, and maxed out dozens of credit cards just to keep Tristan's legs from getting broken by loan sharks. The Vance family was entirely, catastrophically bankrupt. They were exactly 3 weeks away from a bank foreclosure on their home. The only reason, they were crying fake tears and trying to drag me back into the family fold was to forcefully drain my bank accounts and use Arthur's hard-earned money to save their precious firstborn son from his own catastrophic failures. "They don't want a son," Zoe said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust as she tossed a bank statement onto the desk. "They want an ATM to fix their golden boy's mess. They're not getting a single dime," I replied, closing the file, a cold rage settling into my bones. But Richard and Eleanor were getting incredibly desperate. When my silence became deafening, they maliciously changed their tactics. They decided to partner with the devil to force my hand. A few days later, my architectural firm's stock took a sudden, inexplicable minor hit. Vicious whispers started circulating in the tight-knit construction industry. Nasty rumors that Julian Sterling was emotionally unstable, that he was a cruel sociopath actively abandoning his elderly, destitute parents on the street, that his entire firm was built on stolen, embezzled family money. Zoe did some digging and quickly traced the malicious rumors directly back to Mr. Caldwell, a bitter, aging rival architect who had been aggressively trying to buy my firm out for years. Eleanor had gone directly to Caldwell. She sat in his office and fed him a fabricated, highly emotional sob story about me being a monster. In exchange for this scandalous gossip, Caldwell was actively using his media connections to publicly pressure me, hoping the threat of a PR nightmare would force me to settle with my family, and subsequently weaken my firm enough for a hostile takeover. And then, the ultimate insult arrived in the mail. It was an invitation printed on thick, ridiculously expensive cardstock. "You are cordially invited to the 35th vow renewal of Richard and Eleanor Vance." Inside the oversized envelope was a handwritten note from Eleanor. It was the most toxic, breathtakingly manipulative piece of text I had ever read in my life. "Julian, I know you are holding on to childish anger. But you abandoned this family when things got hard for us. Your father's heart is failing because of the stress you caused. Your brother desperately needs you. We are generously willing to forgive your arrogance and welcome you back. But you must prove you know your place in this family. We cannot have you flaunting your undeserved wealth around our important friends. Included in this package is a uniform. You will work the valet stand at our anniversary party. You will serve the family you betrayed. If you refuse to show up and do this simple task, I have an exclusive interview scheduled with the Portland Tribune the very next morning. I will tell them everything about your cruelty. I will ruin your career and your precious little company." I stared at the cheap, plastic-wrapped polyester valet uniform folded inside the cardboard box they had sent. Zoe looked at it, her face turning pale with fury. "Call the lawyers right now, Julian. Slap them with a massive defamation lawsuit. Get a permanent restraining order. Bury them so deep in legal fees they never see daylight again." I slowly picked up the jacket, feeling the rough, insulting fabric against my fingers. A cold, absolute, terrifying calm washed over my entire body. A lawsuit would be a long, drawn-out, boring battle in a sterile courtroom. They would play the victims for a judge. They would cry fake tears and twist the narrative. No, that simply wasn't good enough. I didn't want to just beat them in court. I wanted to completely, publicly break their entire illusion of superiority. I wanted to burn their kingdom to the ground while they stood inside it. I looked down at the luxury venue listed on the glossy invitation. The Harrington Estate, It was a massive, historic, sprawling mansion in the West Hills, often rented out for outrageously high-end events by people desperate to look richer than they actually were. I turned back to my computer, logged into my secure servers, and pulled up my commercial real estate portfolio. I had actually been looking for a new flagship property to convert into a massive community center project. I checked the market listings. The Harrington estate had been sitting quietly on the private market for months. The current owner was a distressed seller, deeply in debt and actively looking for a fast, all-cash closing. "Zoe?" I said, my voice dangerously steady, completely devoid of emotion. "Call our real estate attorneys immediately. Tell them I want to buy the Harrington estate. All cash. Waive the inspections. I want the deed signed and the title legally transferred into my name by 4 p.m. this Friday." Zoe's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. "Julian, that property is easily $15 million. We have the liquidity, but that's an insane rush. And the Vance party is this Saturday night." "I know exactly when the party is," I smiled. A real, genuine, terrifying smile. "I'm going to let my dear mother throw her little party. I'm going to put on the cheap little uniform she sent me. And then, I'm going to walk right into her perfect night and show her exactly who owns the ground she is standing on." I spent the next 48 exhaustive hours executing the most expensive, aggressive real estate transaction of my entire career. My legal team worked around the clock. The paperwork was frantic, the massive wire transfers cleared the banking hurdles, and by 4:15 p.m. on Friday afternoon, the ink was dry. Julian Sterling was the sole legal owner of the Harrington estate. Which brings us right back to tonight, standing in the grand foyer, the jazz music playing, loosening the cheap, scratchy tie. I looked across the crowded room at my mother, Eleanor, who was sipping champagne, entirely unaware that the magnificent roof over her head, the marble floors beneath her feet, belonged to the sickly son she threw away like garbage. She thought I was wearing this uniform as a pathetic sign of submission. She thought I was terrified of her media threats. I reached up, grabbed the lapels of the polyester valet jacket, and prepared to rip it off. It was time to give the Vance family the unforgettable reunion they so desperately deserved. The Harrington estate was a breathtaking masterpiece of classic Pacific Northwest architecture, and as an architect who dedicated his life to understanding the structural integrity of buildings, I intimately understood the bones of the venue we were currently standing in. The massive, load-bearing pillars in the grand foyer were meticulously carved from solid, ancient mahogany, specifically designed by master craftsmen a century ago to carry the immense, crushing weight of the vaulted ceilings above. It was a beautiful structure built entirely on absolute truth, unyielding strength, and uncompromising foundations. It was, in every single measurable way, the exact opposite of the Vance family. Richard and Eleanor Vance were currently standing in the direct center of this magnificent room, drinking expensive champagne, completely oblivious to the undeniable fact that their entire lives were built on a rapidly crumbling foundation of toxic debt, malicious lies, and desperate, pathetic illusions. I stood silently behind the antique wooden coat check counter, the scratchy, horrible polyester collar of that humiliating valet uniform rubbing my neck raw with every tiny movement. I watched the anniversary party unfold before my eyes like a poorly written, highly predictable theatrical play. The room was absolutely packed to the brim with Portland's local elite. There were regional politicians desperately looking for campaign donors, mid-level corporate executives inflating their own importance, and wealthy socialites who spent their entire miserable lives trying to aggressively impress people they secretly despised. My older brother, Tristan, swaggered into the grand foyer. He was wearing a tuxedo that looked slightly too tight around his thick shoulders, likely a cheap, last-minute rental he was desperately trying to pass off as custom European tailoring. He had a heavy crystal glass of amber liquid clutched tightly in his right hand, and his face was already flushed a deep, unhealthy red with alcohol. He walked right up to my coat check counter, aggressively tossing a woman's expensive cashmere winter coat over the polished wood without a single shred of human decency. He didn't even bother to look up at my face. To Tristan Vance, I wasn't a human being. I wasn't his brother. I was just part of the invisible background furniture, a faceless servant specifically designated by society to handle his messes and carry his burdens. "Keep a very close eye on that, buddy," Tristan slurred, leaning heavily against the antique counter, his breath smelling overwhelmingly of cheap scotch and stale mints. "And make absolutely sure your guys don't put a single scratch on the black Audi parked out front. It's a brand new corporate lease, and the dealership management is an absolute nightmare about the exterior paint." He chuckled loudly at his own terrible joke, clumsily adjusting his French cuffs. I looked at him, searching my own soul, and realized I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering anger, no tragic brotherly connection. Just a cold, highly clinical observation of a failing man. This was the legendary golden boy. This was the unstoppable athletic prodigy my parents had happily sacrificed my childhood for. Now, according to the massive, highly detailed private investigation dossier sitting safely locked in my corporate office, he was a washed-up, chronically unemployed gambling addict who owed over $500,000 to incredibly violent loan sharks. The luxury Audi he was loudly bragging about to a valet was undeniably months behind on its lease payments. The absolute, suffocating financial desperation practically radiated off his skin in waves, poorly masked only by heavy designer cologne and expensive liquor. I quietly took the cashmere coat, handed him a small numbered plastic ticket, and watched him stumble blindly back into the massive crowd. A few minutes later, the real architects of my childhood misery stepped perfectly into my direct line of sight. Richard and Eleanor. They were huddled closely together near a massive, melting ice sculpture of two swans, deep in a hushed, intense conversation with a man I recognized instantly. It was Mr. Caldwell. Caldwell was the bitter, aging, entirely unethical rival architect who had been aggressively running a malicious, highly coordinated smear campaign against my firm for the past 3 agonizing weeks. Eleanor had personally gone to his downtown office and fed him absolutely horrific lies about my character, and Caldwell was eagerly, ruthlessly using those fabricated stories to try and force a hostile takeover of my massive commercial real estate portfolio. I stepped slightly out of the deep shadows of the coat room, moving just close enough to hear their hushed conversation over the soft, rhythmic playing of the live jazz band. "You have absolutely nothing to worry about, Eleanor," Caldwell said smoothly, swirling the expensive champagne in his crystal flute. "Julian's firm is taking a massive, unprecedented hit in the local business press. The carefully planted rumors about his highly unstable mental health, his erratic corporate behavior, and his incredibly cruel, heartless treatment of you both are spreading through the city council like wildfire. The corporate board of directors will have no choice but to force him to step down immediately to save the firm's reputation. Or better yet, they will force him to sell his majority shares directly to me for absolute pennies on the dollar." Eleanor smiled, a vicious, triumphant, entirely evil smirk that didn't even come close to reaching her cold eyes. "Good. It is exactly what he deserves. He desperately needs to learn a harsh lesson about family loyalty. He foolishly thinks that just because that old, pathetic man left him a massive inheritance, he is somehow untouchable in this city. We are his real family. We gave him life. We built him. He owes his entire existence to us." Richard puffed his chest out proudly, aggressively adjusting his silk tie with an arrogant flick of his wrist. "The boy is fundamentally weak, Caldwell. He always was a massive financial liability to my household, even when he was just 10 years old crying in his bedroom. He absolutely does not have the stomach or the grit for a real, brutal corporate war. Once you apply the maximum legal pressure with this impending lawsuit threat, Julian will completely fold. He will come crawling back to this family on his hands and knees, begging for our guidance and protection. And when he finally breaks, we will gladly step in, take full legal control of that massive trust fund, and finally secure the Vance family legacy for the next century. Tristan desperately needs that heavy capital injection to start his new logistics venture and clear his current, minor debts." I stood there in the shadows, my heart beating with a slow, terrifying rhythm, listening to my biological father openly, proudly plot to aggressively steal my money to illegally fund his golden boy's catastrophic gambling debts. They were entirely, utterly convinced of their own unmatched brilliance. They genuinely thought they were playing a high-stakes, sophisticated game of corporate chess, while they believed I was simply a mindless pawn they could casually sacrifice for the second time in my entire life. Richard checked his expensive, highly polished, and likely completely counterfeit gold watch. Speaking of massive capital injections, Marcus Thorne should be arriving here any minute now. I've been tirelessly working on securing this vital connection for 6 grueling months. If I can just secure 5 uninterrupted minutes with Thorne tonight in the VIP lounge, I can successfully pitch him on a revolutionary joint logistics venture. Thorne's unlimited investment capital is exactly what this family needs to catapult us permanently into the highest tax bracket in the state. Eleanor patted his arm with overwhelming pride. You are brilliant, Richard. Simply brilliant. Tonight is going to be absolutely perfect. Marcus Thorne. The heavy name echoed loudly in my head. Marcus Thorne was the legendary, highly feared billionaire CEO of a massive international urban development conglomerate. He was an absolute titan of global industry, a man who could easily make or completely break a lifelong career with a single short phone call. Richard Vance desperately, pathetically believed that Marcus Thorne was his ultimate golden ticket out of complete financial ruin and catastrophic bankruptcy. What Richard Vance did absolutely not know, and what was about to systematically, ruthlessly destroy his entire universe in a matter of minutes, was that Marcus Thorne was not coming to this anniversary party to invest a single dime in a bankrupt, washed-up, heavily indebted logistics manager. Marcus Thorne was coming here tonight because his massive conglomerate had just signed a historic, multi-million-dollar urban development contract to revitalize the entire downtown Portland waterfront. And they signed that massive, exclusive contract directly with my architectural firm. Julian Sterling was the lead visionary designer and the primary majority stakeholder on the entire billion-dollar project. Marcus Thorne, the billionaire my father was currently worshipping, practically worked for me. The live jazz band finished their long set, and a soft, expectant murmur rippled through the massive crowd of socialites. I looked at the grand, antique grandfather clock standing in the dark corner of the grand foyer. It was exactly 8:30 in the evening. The trap was now fully set. The wealthy guests were entirely relaxed. The expensive champagne was flowing freely, and the Vance family's collective ego was artificially inflated to its absolute, dangerous maximum capacity. I took a slow, deep, grounding breath. I thought about the freezing, terrifying nights sleeping on a thin mattress in the state-run foster facility. I thought about the hot tears I cried into a cheap, scratchy pillow when I was 10 years old, desperately wondering why I wasn't strong enough or good enough to be unconditionally loved by my own parents. I thought about Arthur Sterling, the incredibly kind, brilliant man who gently picked up the shattered, broken pieces of my life and meticulously taught me how to build an impenetrable fortress around my heart. I owed it to Arthur's brilliant legacy, and I owed it to that terrified, abandoned little boy I used to be, to execute this moment flawlessly. I stepped completely out from behind the heavy mahogany coat check counter. I walked with absolute, unyielding purpose to the direct, undeniable center of the grand foyer, placing myself right in the middle of the sweeping, magnificent double staircase where everyone in the room could see me. Eleanor spotted me almost immediately. Her perfectly manicured eyes widened in absolute horror and unbridled fury. She aggressively, rudely pushed past a waiter carrying a tray of appetizers, her expensive pearl necklace rattling violently against her chest, and marched directly toward me like a predator. "What in the world do you think you are doing?" she hissed. Her voice a venomous, sharp whisper meant only for my ears. "Get back behind that counter this instant. You are actively embarrassing us in front of the mayor, Julian. Do not dare make a public scene tonight, or I swear to God I will call the Tribune right now and absolutely destroy your pathetic little life and your stupid company." I didn't answer her with words. Instead, I simply reached up to the suffocating collar of the cheap, plastic-wrapped polyester valet uniform. With one swift, highly deliberate motion, I unbuttoned the awful jacket. I pulled my arms out of the restrictive sleeves, letting the horrible, scratchy, humiliating fabric slide completely off my shoulders. I dropped the valet uniform directly onto the pristine, imported Italian marble floor, treating it like the absolute garbage it was. Underneath the hideous uniform, I was wearing a $5,000 midnight blue bespoke suit, tailored absolutely flawlessly to my frame by the best craftsmen in the city. I calmly adjusted my heavy silk tie, rolling my broad shoulders back. I didn't look like a terrified, abandoned foster child anymore. I didn't look like a weak, pathetic financial liability. I looked exactly like the incredibly powerful, multimillionaire CEO of a highly dominant architectural empire. Eleanor gasped loudly, taking a physical, stumbling step backward in sheer shock. Richard, noticing the sudden commotion from across the room, hurried over with Mr. Caldwell trailing closely, nervously behind him. "Julian," Richard barked, his face turning that familiar, highly dangerous shade of aggressive red I remembered from my childhood. "Pick that jacket up right now. Have you completely lost your tiny mind? You are a guest in this venue, and you will obey the strict rules of this family." I looked Richard Vance dead in the eyes, a terrifying, absolute calm washing over my entire body like freezing water. I smiled. "I am not a guest, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly, resonating with absolute authority over the sudden, dead silence of the massive foyer. "And you absolutely do not make the rules anymore." Before Richard could scream his next furious insult, the heavy, solid oak front doors of the magnificent Harrington estate swung wide open. The cold, crisp night air rushed violently into the warm, incredibly suffocating foyer, instantly carrying the distinct, heavy, powerful purr of a massive, finely tuned engine. Outside, idling perfectly on the circular, meticulously maintained cobblestone driveway, was a gleaming, pristine jet-black Rolls-Royce Phantom. My personal, highly paid chauffeur had just pulled up, precisely on the exact minute we had scheduled. The actual estate valet, a hard-working man whose generous salary I now personally paid out of my own corporate accounts, rushed forward in a panic and respectfully opened the heavy, armored rear door of the Rolls-Royce. Out stepped Marcus Thorne. Thorne was an incredibly imposing figure, a man in his late 50s with sharp, ruthlessly calculating eyes and a custom-tailored charcoal suit that undoubtedly cost more than Richard Vance's entire remaining net worth. As he walked confidently through the heavy oak doors and stepped onto the marble floor of the foyer, the entire anniversary party fell into a stunned, absolutely breathless silence. This was the ultimate apex predator of the modern corporate world, and his mere presence commanded total submission from the local elite. Richard Vance practically vibrated with desperate, pathetic excitement. He completely ignored the tense standoff with me, stepping aggressively and carelessly right over my discarded valet jacket on the floor. He plastered on his absolute most charming, terrifyingly fake executive smile, straightened his posture, and practically ran across the room toward the billionaire. "Mr. Thorne," Richard boomed loudly, desperately extending his right hand for a firm shake. "Richard Vance, it is an absolute, profound honor to have you at our vow renewal tonight. I have been incredibly eager to discuss a highly lucrative, brilliant logistics synergy with your global development team." Marcus Thorne didn't even break his powerful stride. He looked down at Richard's aggressively extended hand with brief, mild, almost pitying confusion, and then completely, utterly ignored it. He walked right past my biological father as if the man were nothing more than a piece of invisible, highly irrelevant furniture in a hotel lobby. Thorne walked with absolute purpose straight toward the direct center of the grand foyer, stopping exactly 3 feet away from me. The billionaire CEO, a ruthless man who casually commanded global financial markets and dictated international trade, bowed his head slightly in a highly visible gesture of profound, undeniable professional respect. "Mr. Sterling," Thorne said, his voice incredibly deep and echoing loudly in the completely silent room, "I sincerely, deeply apologize for my delay this evening. The city council meeting regarding the zoning permits ran incredibly long, but I absolutely wanted to come here personally to deliver the final, legally signed contracts for the massive waterfront development project." Thorne smiled genuinely, looking around at the magnificent, towering vaulted ceilings, the intricate woodwork, and the glowing crystal chandeliers. And I simply must say, Julian, the aggressive legal paperwork on this Harrington estate acquisition was nothing short of brilliant. My team was incredibly impressed. The massive wire transfer cleared our banking hurdles flawlessly yesterday afternoon. Congratulations on your absolute newest commercial real estate property. It is a truly stunning, historic acquisition for your personal portfolio. The silence in the grand foyer was so absolute, so incredibly heavy and suffocating. You could have heard a single pin drop onto the Italian marble floor. Richard Vance stood completely frozen in the exact middle of the massive room, his hands still awkwardly, pathetically extended in the empty air. His face rapidly transitioned from deep confusion to profound shock to a horrifying, soul-crushing realization. Eleanor looked like all the blood had been instantly drained from her entire body. Her jaw was literally hanging wide open, her panicked eyes darting frantically, desperately back and forth between my calm face and Marcus Thorne's respectful posture. "A acquisition," Richard stammered weakly, his voice cracking horribly, completely devoid of its usual booming, aggressive authority. "Mr. Thorne, please, there absolutely must be some kind of massive misunderstanding here. This is a rented public venue. Julian is just my son. He's an arrogant, highly ungrateful boy who runs a very small, struggling firm." Marcus Thorne turned his body slowly, looking at Richard Vance with an expression of cold, highly clinical, almost surgical pity. "You must be severely, dangerously misinformed, sir. Julian Sterling is the uncontested majority shareholder and CEO of Sterling Architectural Enterprises. His personal firm's net worth currently exceeds $50 million. And as of exactly 48 hours ago, Mr. Sterling successfully purchased the exclusive deed to the Harrington estate in a highly aggressive all-cash transaction. He legally owns the historic walls around you, the marble floor beneath your feet, and the magnificent roof over your head." I stepped forward slowly, deliberately closing the physical distance between myself and my biological parents. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to scream or shout to assert dominance. When you hold absolutely all the power in the room, a quiet whisper is infinitely louder and more terrifying than a desperate scream. "Welcome to my new home, Richard," I said, my voice incredibly smooth, unwavering, and ice-cold. "I sincerely hope the expensive catering is to your liking tonight. I made absolutely sure to approve the menu myself when I reviewed the property's operational budget." Eleanor let out a sharp, incredibly strangled gasp, clutching her throat. "Julian, you actually bought this entire house?" "I bought the estate, Eleanor," I corrected her softly, my eyes locking onto hers with unblinking intensity. "I bought it because I absolutely do not like receiving pathetic extortion letters in the mail. You sent me a cheap, humiliating valet uniform and aggressively threatened to destroy my entire corporate career with fabricated media leaks and highly illegal defamation. You genuinely thought you could publicly humiliate me into blindly paying off Tristan's massive, dangerous gambling debts. You thought I was still that terrified, helpless 10-year-old boy you mercilessly threw away at the county office without a second thought." The shocked murmurs suddenly erupted loudly among the wealthy guests. The elite socialites Eleanor had spent decades desperately trying to impress were now aggressively whispering, pointing fingers, and staring directly at the Vance family with unfiltered, highly visible disgust. The carefully crafted, obsessively maintained illusion of the perfect, wealthy, dominant American family was violently shattering into a million irreparable pieces in real time, right in front of their eyes. I completely ignored their panic and turned my undivided attention to Mr. Caldwell, the bitter rival architect who had been eagerly spreading the malicious rumors. Caldwell was desperately trying to edge his way toward the heavy front doors, his pale face slick with terrified, nervous sweat. "Mr. Caldwell?" I called out sharply, completely freezing the man in his tracks. "Leaving the party so soon?" I received the highly detailed legal brief from my corporate attorneys early this morning. "We are officially aggressively filing a multimillion-dollar defamation and corporate sabotage lawsuit against you and your entire firm at exactly 8 a.m. on Monday morning. We have hard, undeniable documentary evidence, including legally recorded statements and digital paper trails, proving you maliciously collaborated with Eleanor Vance to illegally manipulate my firm's public stock price. By the time my ruthless legal team is completely finished with you, you will be entirely bankrupt, stripped of your architectural license, and you won't even be legally allowed to design a wooden doghouse in this entire state. Caldwell looked like he was going to be violently, physically sick all over the marble floor. He didn't say a single word in his defense. He just turned, pushed past a waiter, and practically sprinted out the massive front doors, fleeing cowardly into the dark night. Tristan, my supposed golden boy brother, finally pushed his heavy way to the absolute front of the stunned crowd. The liquid courage from the alcohol had instantly evaporated from his system. He looked at me, his bloodshot eyes wide with genuine, absolute, life-threatening panic. He finally, truly realized that the calm man standing in front of him in the bespoke suit wasn't his childhood punching bag anymore. It was his ultimate executioner. Julian, man, please listen to me, Tristan stammered pathetically, holding his large hands up defensively in a gesture of total surrender. This is completely crazy. We're brothers, man. You're completely loaded. You can't just leave us hanging out to dry like this. The guys I owe money to, they're incredibly dangerous. They're not messing around anymore. They're going to permanently break my legs, Julian. Or worse, you have to help me out. You have the money. Blood is thicker than water. Is it really? I asked, tilting my head slightly, staring at the incredibly pathetic, broken man trembling in front of me. Where exactly was that sacred blood loyalty when I was literally starving in a freezing state-run group home? Where was that fierce family loyalty when our father looked at me and called me a weak, pathetic financial liability? You aren't my brother, Tristan. You never were. You were just a bankrupt, failed addict standing in my foyer, desperately begging for a financial handout from a man you spent your entire miserable life violently despising. I reached slowly inside the interior breast pocket of my custom bespoke suit and pulled out a thick, heavily folded stack of official legal papers. It was a direct, unredacted copy of the private investigator's massive, highly detailed financial dossier. I know absolutely everything, I announced loudly to the entire room, making absolutely sure every single one of their high society friends heard me crystal clearly. I know all about the second and third high-interest mortgages you took out to maintain your fake lifestyle. I know about the complete, desperate liquidation of your 401k retirement funds. I know your suburban house is facing active, undeniable bank foreclosure in exactly 21 days. And I know all about the massive $500,000 Tristan currently owes to an incredibly violent, illegal sports betting syndicate. Eleanor immediately began to openly, hysterically weep, the heavy, expensive mascara running rapidly down her pale face in dark, incredibly ugly streaks. Julian, please, I am begging you to stop this. You are utterly humiliating us in front of everyone we know. I am your mother. You permanently lost the absolute right to ever use that word the exact day you stood at the sink, casually washing a coffee mug, and watched your husband drag me out of your house in the freezing rain. I replied, my voice completely, terrifyingly dead of any human emotion. I turned slowly back to Richard, the man who had mercilessly terrorized my childhood. The man who demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience from everyone around him. Standing there in his rented tuxedo, his massive ego completely destroyed, he looked incredibly small. He looked incredibly, pathetically old. The aggressive, dominant alpha male facade had instantly collapsed, leaving behind absolutely nothing but a terrified, bankrupt, highly exposed fraud. You proudly told me at Thanksgiving that a Vance builds massive empires, I said quietly, looking down at him with nothing but absolute pity. You were completely wrong, Richard. You built a fragile, pathetic house of cards. And tonight, I just blew it down. The atmosphere in the massive grand foyer shifted instantly from stunned, breathless silence to a frantic, incredibly embarrassing mass public exodus. The wealthy elite of Portland, the very high society people Eleanor and Richard had literally sacrificed their own son and their entire financial future to aggressively impress, wanted absolutely nothing to do with the highly contagious stench of catastrophic bankruptcy and illegal, violent gambling debts. They quietly, swiftly put down their expensive crystal champagne flutes, practically ran to the coat check to retrieve their belongings from the stunned, wide-eyed valet staff, and rushed hurriedly out the heavy front doors without offering so much as a single, polite goodbye to the Vance family. Within exactly 10 incredibly chaotic minutes, the $15 million Harrington estate was entirely, completely empty of guests, save for myself, Marcus Thorne, who watched with silent approval, my highly trained private security team, and the pathetic, crying remnants of the Vance family. Richard's broad shoulders completely sagged, as if the invisible strings holding him upright had been violently cut. The aggressive, endless fight was completely, undeniably gone from his dull eyes. He looked around the massive, utterly empty room, realizing with crushing clarity that his elevated social standing, his entire financial future, and his desperately guarded family legacy had just been completely vaporized in front of his eyes. He slowly, shakily stepped toward me, his large hands trembling violently at his sides. And then, he did the one absolute thing I never, ever thought I would see the great Richard Vance do in my entire lifetime. He dropped heavily to his knees on the cold, hard Italian marble floor. "Julian," Richard actually sobbed, his voice a pathetic, broken, wheeze echoing in the empty hall. "Julian, please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. I was a terrible, horrible father. I was a cruel monster. I admit it all. Punish me however you want. But please, son, please save your older brother. They are actually going to kill Tristan. The loan sharks. They don't care about our excuses or our apologies. If you have millions in the bank, a few $100,000 is absolutely nothing to you. It's pocket change. Be the bigger man, Julian. Save your family's life." Eleanor immediately fell heavily to her knees right beside him, desperately grabbing the pristine hem of my bespoke suit pants with her shaking hands. "We will do absolutely anything you ask. We will sign any legal contract. We will move away forever and never bother you again. Just pay the gambling debt, Julian. I brought you into this world. You owe me your life." I stood there in the silence, looking down at the two people kneeling pathetically at my feet. For 16 incredibly long years, throughout all the lonely nights in foster care and the grueling years building my firm, I had actively fantasized about this exact, specific moment. I genuinely thought that seeing the cruel people who broke me finally groveling and crying for my mercy would bring me some profound, explosive, overwhelming joy. I thought I would feel an incredible, healing sense of ultimate vindication. But looking deeply at them crying on my expensive floor, I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel a single ounce of triumph. I just felt an overwhelming, incredibly heavy sense of absolute nothingness. They were completely pathetic. They weren't the terrifying monsters of my childhood anymore. They were just sad, broken, incredibly selfish people who had systematically destroyed their own lives through sheer, unadulterated arrogance and greed. I gently, but with absolute unyielding firmness, stepped backward, smoothly pulling my expensive pant leg out of Eleanor's desperate, clawing grip. "Get up," I commanded, my voice flat, cold, and echoing loudly off the vaulted ceilings. They slowly, hesitantly scrambled to their feet, their faces heavily stained with running tears and sheer desperation, a tiny, pathetic sliver of hope suddenly sparking in their red eyes. They actually, foolishly thought their pathetic, theatrical display of crying had worked on my emotions. They genuinely thought I was going to pull out a checkbook and blindly write them a massive check to save them from their own terrible consequences. I didn't reach for a pen. Instead, I simply raised my hand and signaled sharply to the head of my highly paid private security detail, a massive, heavily tattooed former Marine named Davis. He stepped forward instantly, his face completely devoid of emotion. "Richard, Eleanor, Tristan, I said, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth or human connection. I am absolutely not your savior. I am not a personal ATM machine for your catastrophic failures. And I am most certainly legally and emotionally not your son. I will absolutely not pay a single solitary cent toward Tristan's illegal, violent debts. If dangerous men come looking to violently break his legs, I strongly suggest he finally learns how to run very fast. Tristan let out a loud, incredibly pathetic, high-pitched wail, desperately hiding his red face in his shaking hands and turning away from me. Furthermore, as the sole, legal owner of this commercial property, I continued, unyielding, staring directly into Richard's defeated eyes. I am officially, legally terminating your rental agreement for this venue, effective immediately. As of this exact second, you are legally trespassing on private property. Eleanor gasped loudly, dramatically clutching her chest as if she had been shot. Julian, you can't be serious. It's our 35th anniversary. You can't violently throw us out onto the dark street in the middle of the night. We have nowhere else to go. I looked at her, tilting my head slightly to the side. A cold, incredibly sharp memory suddenly flashed vividly behind my eyes. The heavy Portland rain, the sterile county office, the single, battered little suitcase holding my entire life. I am giving you exactly 10 minutes to completely vacate my property, I said, my voice dropping to a highly dangerous, absolute whisper that carried total authority. My security team will physically escort you to the front door. If you desperately need to pack any leftover catering food or personal belongings, you are allowed one single suitcase. Exactly one. Nothing more. The absolute, devastating poetry of that specific moment hit Richard Vance like a brutal, physical punch to the stomach. He staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but absolutely no sound came out. He finally, truly understood the absolute, terrifying finality of what was happening to him. Karma had not just arrived at his doorstep. It had meticulously audited his entire cruel life and handed down the final, undeniable verdict. Take them out, Davis, I ordered firmly, turning away. I completely turned my back on them. I didn't bother to watch as my massive security team physically, aggressively herded the sobbing, broken, ruined Vance family out the heavy oak doors of the Harrington estate. I didn't listen to their fading, pathetic pleas for mercy echoing in the driveway. I just calmly walked over to the expensive bar, poured myself a simple glass of sparkling water, and looked peacefully out the massive bay windows into the dark, incredibly quiet night. The violent storm of my past was finally over. The monsters were permanently gone. 2 incredibly peaceful, highly productive years passed. The entire architectural skyline of Portland was rapidly changing, and my powerful firm was the one confidently drawing the bold new lines. The massive Harrington estate, the site of my final victory, had been completely, systematically gutted and beautifully remodeled. It was completely transformed from a symbol of wealthy excess into the highly acclaimed, state-of-the-art headquarters for the newly formed Sterling Foundation. We absolutely didn't host lavish, pointless parties for arrogant billionaires anymore. Instead, we exclusively hosted massive charity galas to aggressively fund comprehensive higher education, mental health therapy, and secure housing programs for vulnerable teenagers who were actively aging out of the state foster care system. We gave them the absolute safety I never had. The Vance family, on the other hand, had completely, predictably collapsed, exactly as the financial numbers dictated they would. The bank officially, aggressively foreclosed on their massive suburban home exactly 3 weeks after the disastrous anniversary party. Richard and Eleanor were forced to publicly declare absolute, humiliating Chapter 7 bankruptcy, and were forced to move into a cramped, depressing, incredibly cheap one-bedroom apartment on the dangerous outskirts of the city. Tristan, absolutely terrified for his life from the violent men hunting him endlessly for his massive gambling debts, had cowardly fled the state in the middle of the night. Last I heard through the grapevine, the former untouchable golden boy was working the grueling night shift at a massive, unforgiving shipping warehouse in rural Nevada, his meager hourly wages being aggressively, legally garnished by relentless creditors. They never, ever tried to contact me again. The massive, impenetrable legal wall my highly paid attorneys aggressively built around my life was utterly flawless and completely unbreakable. But the universe, I've learned, always has an incredibly funny, highly satisfying way of perfectly tying up loose ends. I was sitting comfortably in my massive, sunlit corner office on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, meticulously looking over the final structural blueprints for a massive new affordable housing complex downtown. My executive assistant quickly buzzed the intercom, formally announcing the arrival of the final, highly anticipated candidate for our newly opened chief financial officer position. The heavy glass door opened smoothly, and a man in his late 30s confidently walked in. He looked incredibly sharp, highly intelligent, and intensely, visibly nervous. I recognized his face instantly from the private investigator's massive dossier from 2 years ago. His name was Harrison. He was the brilliant, incredibly meticulous, albeit previously misguided, forensic accountant who used to secretly manage the complex financial books for Tristan Vance and his highly illegal gambling associates. "Mr. Sterling," Harrison said respectfully, sitting down carefully across from my massive mahogany desk, placing a sleek, expensive leather briefcase gently on the floor. "Thank you so much for the incredible opportunity to interview with your prestigious firm today. You have a very, very interesting corporate resume, Harrison," I said, leaning back comfortably in my expensive leather chair, steepling my fingers together. "You clearly have the brilliant intellect and the aggressive drive for high-level corporate finance. But I know exactly who you used to work for. I know you personally managed the Vance family's catastrophic financial downfall. Why on earth would I ever hire the exact man who actively handled the illegal finances of my greatest personal enemies?" Harrison didn't flinch. He didn't break eye contact. He simply reached smoothly into his tailored suit pocket and slowly pulled out a small, highly encrypted silver USB drive. He placed it gently, deliberately on the direct center of my desk. "Because, Mr. Sterling, I absolutely do not work for desperate criminals anymore," Harrison said, his voice incredibly steady and filled with conviction. "I stood by and watched the Vance family completely destroy themselves with unbridled greed and sheer arrogance. But more importantly, I watched Richard Vance aggressively lie, cheat, and commit massive, highly illegal tax evasion for years just to artificially fund his massive ego. On that highly encrypted drive is the complete, unredacted, undeniable documentary history of Richard Vance's massive financial fraud. Wire fraud, illegal offshore tax evasion, and massive corporate embezzlement from his former logistics company. Absolutely everything you need to end him." I looked down at the small silver drive resting on the wood. It was the absolute, undeniable final nail in the coffin. It was more than enough hard, legal evidence to put Richard Vance in a federal prison cell for the rest of his natural, miserable life. "Why give this highly explosive information to me?" I asked, watching him incredibly carefully. "Consider it a highly unique resume builder," Harrison replied with a faint, deeply respectful smile. "I desperately want to work for a brilliant man who builds real, lasting foundations. Not a pathetic family that builds fragile houses of cards. I want to be entirely on the right side of history, Julian. I want to help you build an empire." I smiled. A real, genuine, incredibly satisfied smile. I smoothly picked up the silver USB drive, immediately handing it off to Zoe, who had just walked into the office with a stack of files. "Zoe, please send this incredibly important drive directly to our senior legal team. Have them formally, aggressively submit it to the federal authorities by exactly 5 o'clock today. And then, please draw up a highly lucrative executive employment contract for our brilliant new CFO." I stood up, smoothly adjusting the crisp cuffs of my bespoke shirt. The massive, invisible weight that I hadn't even realized I was still heavily carrying completely, instantly lifted off my broad shoulders. The haunting ghosts of my past were finally exorcised. It was truly, finally, undeniably over. I confidently walked out of the massive corporate building, the bright afternoon sun feeling incredibly warm and healing against my face. I handed my ticket to the young valet, a brilliant kid whose entire college tuition my foundation was currently happily paying for, and he quickly brought my gleaming silver Porsche 911 around to the front entrance. The powerful engine roared to life with a beautiful, aggressive sound of absolute, unbridled freedom. I drove smoothly up the winding roads into the West Hills, pulling confidently through the heavy, secure iron gates of the Sterling Foundation. The massive, beautiful courtyard was incredibly alive with joyful activity. Teenagers who had been brutally abandoned, horribly abused, and completely forgotten by the broken system were sitting peacefully on the manicured green lawns, studying for college exams, laughing loudly, and simply, safely existing in a space where they were completely, unconditionally protected. I parked the silver Porsche and walked slowly toward the direct center of the vibrant courtyard. I reached deeply into my pocket and pulled out a small, heavily worn, incredibly precious silver key. It was the original front door key to the craftsman house Arthur Sterling had given me the exact day he officially, legally adopted me. I gently rubbed my thumb over the cold, familiar metal. "We built it, Dad," I thought, looking up at the bright, endless blue sky. "We finally built something beautiful that they can never, ever take away." Family is absolutely, unequivocally not defined by the accidental blood running through your veins. Blood is nothing more than a random accident of biology. True family is defined entirely by the incredible people who actively choose to stand fiercely by your side when your walls are completely crumbling down. Family is defined by profound respect, by unwavering loyalty, and by the relentless, daily choice to love someone, not for what they can financially do for your ego, but for exactly who they are in their soul. Richard and Eleanor Vance gave me my biological DNA, but Arthur Sterling gave me my actual soul. And nobody, no matter how hard they try, can ever violently evict you from a massive fortress you build permanently inside your own heart. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard, incredibly painful boundary to protect your own peace and your future? Please share your incredible story in the comments below. Your survival might be the exact blueprint someone else desperately needs to read to escape their own darkness. And don't forget to please like and subscribe so you don't miss the very next journey. Until next time, keep building your own beautiful future.